In the cold, unforgiving mountains of Montana, winter holds a harsh and relentless grip. The landscape is a vast stretch of snow-covered wilderness, where the trees stand bare and the air bites with freezing winds. The snow falls thick, coating everything in a blanket of white, making it nearly impossible to distinguish where the earth ends and the sky begins. The beauty of the land is undeniable, but it is a beauty laced with danger. In this remote wilderness, survival is a constant struggle. Every living creature here faces a daily battle for food, warmth, and safety. The animals that call these mountains home are tough, resilient, and adapt to the harsh conditions in ways that might seem almost impossible to those unfamiliar with the relentless cruelty of nature. It is into this brutal environment that Rocky, a young grizzly bear cub, was born. Only 4 months old, he is small and fragile, not yet fully capable of surviving on his own. His fur is thick, but it offers little protection against the biting cold of the Montana winter. Rocky's journey begins in a way that no cub should ever face, alone. Abandoned by his mother, in a cruel twist of fate. His mother vanished during a hunting trip, leaving Rocky to fend for himself in the wild. This young cub, barely old enough to walk confidently, now faces the unforgiving world of the wilderness without the protection or guidance of his mother. At just 4 months old, Rocky is still learning the basics of survival. His tiny body struggles to generate enough warmth to survive the cold nights. His stomach growls constantly, as he has not yet learned how to hunt for food. Rocky's survival depends on instinct. And even though he's just a cub, he has inherited the instincts of his kind, sharp, keen, and relentless. But even the strongest instincts cannot always guarantee survival in a world where every step could be his last. The mountains of Montana are home to many predators, and Rocky is well aware of this. From the towering black bears that roam the forests to the stealthy wolves that travel in packs. Danger lurks at every corner. Though he is young and inexperienced, Rocky's instincts tell him to be cautious, to stay hidden, and to keep moving. He has learned to trust his nose, his ears, and his sense of smell, as these senses are the only tools he has to detect any approaching threats. Rocky's days are spent wandering the snow-covered forest in search of food. He has no real understanding of how to hunt. Instead, he scavenges, searching for whatever scraps of food he can find. A discarded carcass from a recent kill might offer a meal if he is lucky. But his search is often in vain. The cold makes food scarce. And even when Rocky finds something to eat, it's never enough to satisfy the hunger that gnaws at his belly. The snow is deep, and every step is a struggle. The weight of the snow presses down on the young cub, making it harder to move and forcing him to use all his strength to push through the drifts. Every step feels like an eternity. As the days pass, his hunger grows, and his strength wanes. The cold seems to seep deeper into his bones, and sleep becomes a refuge that he can never seem to fully find. When he rests, he is always on high alert, knowing that at any moment, he could be attacked by something far stronger than he is. As the days turn into weeks, Rocky's instincts continue to sharpen. He learns the importance of staying hidden, of avoiding any conflict with the larger predators of the forest. He watches from a distance as wolves roam the hillsides, looking for prey. His heart pounds in his chest as he watches them move through the snow. Their eyes sharp and focused, Rocky knows that they could easily overpower him. and he has no choice but to stay hidden until they leave. His eyes are constantly searching for signs of danger. Every rustle in the snow, every snap of a twig, sends him into a state of alertness. Despite the overwhelming odds stacked against him, Rocky is not without hope. There are moments of quiet solace, brief glimpses of warmth and security. Sometimes, he will find a small patch of sunlight filtering through the trees, offering a moment of relief from the cold. And sometimes, when the wind dies down and the world around him becomes still, Rocky finds a sense of peace in the snow-covered forest. In these moments, he feels the faintest sense of comfort. It is fleeting, but it is enough to keep him going. The mountains of Montana, with their stark beauty and harsh conditions, are unforgiving. Rocky's survival in this vast wilderness is uncertain. Every day is a battle, a struggle against the elements and the dangers that lurk in the shadows. Yet, through it all, the young cub continues to push forward, relying on the instincts and strength passed down through generations of his kind. He may be small, but he is a survivor, and as long as there is breath in his body, he will continue to fight for his place in the world. Rocky, hungry and desperate, decided to venture out from his hidden spot deep in the forest. The hunger pains in his small stomach gnawed at him, urging him to find something to eat. The cold, sharp air made it hard to focus on anything but the emptiness he felt inside. He had spent the last few days hiding, searching for food, and now he was growing weaker by the hour. The snow beneath his paws was thick and heavy, but he pushed on, his instincts urging him to keep going. The trees around him were silent, their branches heavy with snow, and the only sound was the crunch of his own footsteps as he trudged through the deep, white drifts. But his hunger drove him further than he should have gone. Without the protective guidance of his mother, Rocky was wandering farther into the forest than he had ever dared before. He did not know the dangers that lurked beyond the trees, nor did he understand that every choice could be his last. The forest, vast and open, was not as empty as it seemed. Unbeknownst to Rocky, a pack of wolves was not far behind, their sharp noses catching his scent on the cold wind. The wolves were hungry, too, and they had been tracking Rocky for hours. The pack, led by a large and imposing wolf named Thunder, was closing in. Thunder was the alpha, the leader of the pack, and he was a seasoned hunter. His dark fur blended with the shadows, and his amber eyes gleamed with determination. The scent of the young cub had drawn the pack in, and now they were ready to strike. Wolves travel in packs because they are stronger together, and Thunder knew that with his pack, they would overpower Rocky in no time. The small bear had no chance against them. Rocky, unaware of the growing threat, continued to move deeper into the forest. His eyes scanned the snow-covered ground, searching for any sign of food. His body ached, and the cold was becoming unbearable. He had no time to think about the dangers around him, his focus solely on the need to fill his stomach. But as he moved, he felt an unsettling shift in the air. Something wasn't right. The silence of the forest, which had once seemed peaceful, now felt heavy. His fur stood on end, his senses alert. He sniffed the air, but there was no scent of anything familiar, nothing that he could recognize as safe. Then he heard it, a faint rustling sound in the snow, a shift in the wind. It was too late to run. The wolves had surrounded him, their eyes glowing from the shadows of the trees. Thunder, the alpha, stepped forward, his powerful form emerging from behind a snow-laden tree. The rest of the pack followed, their eyes fixed on the young cub. They were lean and hungry, their fur slick with the cold. Rocky's heart raced, and his legs felt weak beneath him. He froze for a moment, trying to assess the situation. He was alone, small, and vulnerable. The wolves, on the other hand, were skilled hunters, their pack mentality making them a force to be reckoned with. Thunder let out a low growl, a warning to the young bear. Rocky backed away slowly, his paws sinking deeper into the snow. His mind raced, trying to remember what his mother had taught him. But those lessons felt far away now. The pack was closing in, and there was no way to outrun them. His instinct told him to fight, to defend himself, but he was too young and too weak to stand a chance. His small body trembled, not just from the cold but from the fear that now gripped his heart. The wolves moved closer, circling him, their growls growing louder. Thunder was patient, letting his pack close the gap, each wolf taking its place in the perimeter. Rocky's breath came in shallow gasps, the cold air stinging his lungs. He was trapped, his body too small to break through the circle of wolves closing in on him. His eyes darted from one wolf to another, but they were all too quick, too coordinated. There was nowhere to go. There was no escape. As the wolves drew nearer, Thunder gave a signal, and the pack advanced. Rocky's heart pounded in his chest, and his claws dug into the snow beneath him. This was it, he thought. The end. The pack was relentless, and his hunger had led him right into their grasp. He tried to make himself seem larger, to make himself seem threatening. But the wolves were not afraid. They were hungry, and they knew how to hunt. In that moment, when he thought all was lost, something unexpected happened. A crackling sound echoed through the forest, followed by a deep growl. The wolves stopped in their tracks, momentarily distracted by the sound. Rocky's eyes widened as he looked up and saw a massive shape emerging from the trees. It was another bear, much larger than Rocky. The newcomer, a full-grown grizzly, was moving toward the pack with purpose. Thunder, the alpha, lowered his head, sensing the threat. The pack hesitated, unsure of whether to challenge the new arrival. The larger bear, with fur thick and powerful, advanced slowly, his eyes locked on Thunder. The wolves growled, but they did not move. They knew that taking on a full-grown bear would be a challenge even for them. The standoff lasted for only a few moments. But to Rocky, it felt like an eternity. The pack finally decided to retreat, slipping silently back into the shadows of the forest. Thunder gave one last look at Rocky, his amber eyes filled with a mix of frustration and respect, before leading his pack away. The larger bear turned to Rocky, his eyes softening as he regarded the young cub. Rocky, still trembling, took a step back, unsure of what to do. The bear's presence was overwhelming, but there was no threat in his gaze. After a long pause, the older bear lowered his head slightly, as if to acknowledge the cub. Rocky felt a flicker of relief, but also confusion. He had no idea who this bear was or why he had come to his rescue. The older bear gave a grunt, then turned and disappeared back into the forest, leaving Rocky standing alone in the snow, his heart still racing. Rocky was shaken, but alive. He had narrowly escaped death. And though the wolves had retreated, the dangers of the wild were far from over. As he stood in the snow, his mind was spinning with what had just happened. He knew that his survival depended on more than just avoiding predators. It depended on learning, growing, and adapting to the brutal world around him. But for now, all he could do was breathe, thankful for the unexpected intervention that had saved his life. Jim Harrison, a retired biologist, had spent much of his life studying wildlife in the rugged landscapes of Montana. Now, in his later years, he found peace in the quiet rhythm of nature, but he still couldn't shake his desire to understand the animals he had spent decades observing. Despite his retirement, Jim continued to monitor the wilderness, keeping track of animal populations and the delicate balance of the ecosystem. He had seen countless survival struggles over the years, from wolves hunting elk to grizzly bears scavenging for food. He knew the dangers the creatures faced and understood that nature's harshness was often unavoidable. But he also had a deep respect for the wilderness and its creatures. A respect that had shaped his entire career. One crisp winter afternoon, while Jim sat in his small cabin, his thoughts were interrupted by a sound that immediately caught his attention, a weak, desperate cry carried on the wind. It wasn't the call of an animal he recognized. It wasn't the distant howl of a wolf or the sharp yelp of a coyote. No, this was something different, something softer, something more desperate. It was the cry of a bear cub. Jim's heart skipped a beat. He stood up quickly, his instincts kicking in. He had heard the cries of young animals before, but this one was filled with a deep sense of fear. The kind that comes only when an animal knows its life is in danger. Without hesitation, Jim grabbed his coat and stepped out into the snow-covered wilderness. His years of fieldwork had trained him to move quickly and quietly through the forests. And he knew exactly where to go. The wind was strong, biting through his layers, but Jim hardly noticed. He was focused entirely on that distant cry. As he walked, he listened carefully, trying to pinpoint the direction from which it had come. The cold didn't bother him much, after all. He had spent years in these mountains, and the chill had long since become familiar. He moved steadily, following the faint trail in the snow, each step deliberate. The trees around him loomed tall and silent, the snow-covered ground crunching underfoot. The wind whistled through the branches. But Jim's attention was fully absorbed by the sound he had heard earlier. It seemed faint at first, but as he pressed on, it grew louder. There was no mistaking it now. This was the cry of a bear cub in distress. As he approached the area where he believed the sound was coming from, Jim slowed his pace. His senses were on high alert, as they always were when he was out in the field. He knew that intervening in the wild could have unintended consequences. The natural order of things was delicate, and disrupting it could lead to problems that might ripple through the ecosystem in ways that couldn't be predicted. He had spent years studying the intricate web of life in the wilderness, and he understood that each animal played a crucial role in maintaining balance. But as he neared the source of the cry, Jim couldn't help but feel a surge of concern. The situation seemed dire, and the young cub's plight was impossible to ignore. Jim had developed a keen understanding of the predators in these mountains, particularly the wolves that roamed the area. He had long known that wolves were a necessary part of the ecosystem, keeping the populations of other animals in check. However, he also understood that the pack's hunt was relentless, and in this case, the young cub was not yet strong enough to defend itself. Rocky, the bear cub, was vulnerable, and his chances of survival were slim. Jim's experience told him that the wolf pack, led by Thunder, would not hesitate to take down an easy target. and he feared that without intervention, Rocky would not make it out of this alive. Over the years, Jim had developed a device designed to deter predators. It was a simple yet effective tool, a high-pitched sound emitter that he had used in his studies to disrupt the behavior of predators. The device was not meant to harm the animals but rather to create a sound that would cause them to retreat without causing lasting harm. Jim had tested it numerous times, always with caution and consideration for the animals. It was a last resort, meant to protect wildlife when intervention was absolutely necessary. This, Jim knew, was one of those times. Without another thought, Jim took the device from his pack and activated it. The high-pitched sound hummed through the cold air, a shrill noise that only predators could hear. It wasn't painful, but it was unpleasant, a sound that would drive the wolves away. Jim knew that it would take a few moments for the wolves to register the noise and decide to retreat. But he was willing to take that risk. He couldn't let the young cub fall prey to the pack. The sound echoed through the trees, and for a few tense moments, there was silence. Then, Jim heard it, the rustling of the wolves retreating. The sound was faint at first, but as the minutes passed, it became more pronounced. The pack was leaving, their growls fading into the distance. Jim stood still, watching carefully, his breath visible in the cold air. He knew the wolves wouldn't give up easily, but the sound would drive them away for now. He held his breath, hoping that his decision had been the right one. The cry of the cub, once filled with terror, now seemed quieter. Jim's heart lifted slightly, but he wasn't out of the woods yet. He moved cautiously toward the source of the sound, keeping a careful watch for any sign of danger. When he finally spotted Rocky, the cub was huddled in the snow, trembling from fear and cold. His small body was shivering, and his wide eyes were filled with confusion. He had survived the immediate threat, but he was still vulnerable. Jim knelt down slowly, trying to make himself as non-threatening as possible. He knew better than to approach a wild animal too quickly, but he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of responsibility for the cub's safety. Rocky looked up at him with fear in his eyes, unsure of who this stranger was. Jim remained still, waiting for the cub to make the first move. After a few moments, Rocky cautiously stood up, his legs shaky, and took a tentative step toward Jim. He could sense that the immediate threat had passed, but the wilderness was still a dangerous place for a young cub like him. Jim knew that the best thing for the cub was to leave him be. The natural world had its own way of sorting out survival, and sometimes, nature had to take its course. But for now, Jim was content knowing that he had given the cub a chance. He stood up and slowly backed away, giving Rocky the space he needed to recover. As he turned and made his way back through the trees, Jim couldn't shake the feeling that he had done something more than just protect an animal. He had made a decision that was difficult, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. But in that moment, he knew it was the right one. After Jim's intervention, the decision was made to take Rocky to the wildlife rehabilitation center run by his daughter, Sarah, a professional veterinarian with years of experience. Sarah had dedicated her life to caring for animals in need, from those injured by human activities to those struggling to survive in the wild. Her center, located in a quiet corner of Montana, was a haven for creatures that needed a second chance. The center was equipped with the necessary facilities to nurse animals back to health. And Sarah's passion for wildlife was reflected in the tireless care she provided. Jim knew that Rocky would be in good hands with Sarah and her team. And so, after carefully transporting the bear cub to the center, he left the young bear in the capable hands of his daughter. Rocky, though weak and fragile, was still very much a wild creature. His eyes, filled with fear and confusion, stared up at Sarah as she and her team assessed his condition. They moved gently and methodically, as they always did when handling a wounded or frightened animal. Rocky was just a cub, still learning about the world, and his body had been battered by the harshness of the wilderness. His coat was thin and patchy, his ribs showing beneath the layers of fur. Despite the damage done, there was still a spark of life in the cub, and that was enough for Sarah to know that they had a chance to help him recover. The first priority was to stabilize Rocky. The team provided him with fluids to combat dehydration, and they carefully checked for any injuries he might have sustained from the wolfpack's attack. Luckily, Rocky had managed to escape without any serious wounds, though the trauma from the attack had left him weak and exhausted. They gave him nourishment, slowly introducing food that was easy for his young body to digest. Sarah watched closely, her heart aching as she saw how fragile the cub was. It was clear that Rocky had been through more than any young bear should have to endure. But Sarah knew that with time, patience, and the right care, he could heal. Over the next few days, Sarah and her team worked tirelessly to nurse Rocky back to health. They provided him with a quiet, safe space away from the other animals at the center, allowing him to rest and recover without the stress of competition or danger. Rocky was frightened at first, not used to being cared for by humans. He would shy away from Sarah and the other staff members, retreating to the far corners of his enclosure whenever they approached. But Sarah understood this behavior. She had worked with countless wild animals over the years, and she knew that trust had to be earned, not forced. Slowly but surely, Rocky began to relax, recognizing that these humans weren't a threat but were there to help him. After a few weeks, Rocky's condition began to improve. His coat, once patchy and dull, started to fill in with thicker fur, and his body began to gain back some of the weight he had lost in the wild. He still had a long way to go, but the signs of recovery were promising. His movements became less stiff, and he started to explore his enclosure, sniffing around and investigating his surroundings with more curiosity. Sarah and her team were careful not to overwhelm him, allowing him to regain his strength at his own pace. They knew that the journey to recovery was just as much about giving him the time he needed as it was about providing the right care. During this period of healing, Sarah and her team focused not only on Rocky's physical recovery but also on preparing him for life in the wild. The goal of the rehabilitation center was always to return the animals to their natural habitat, and they worked with each creature to help them relearn the skills necessary for survival. For Rocky, this meant teaching him how to forage for food, how to recognize safe sources of nourishment, and how to fend for himself in the wild. It wasn't an easy process. After all, Rocky had been young and inexperienced when he was first found. He had not yet learned the essential skills that every bear needed to survive. And now, he had to play catch-up. Sarah knew that it would take time and patience, but she was determined to give him the best chance for success. The rehabilitation process was methodical. Every day, Sarah would take Rocky outside to a larger, more natural enclosure, where he could begin to practice the skills he would need in the wild. The first task was teaching him to forage for food. At first, Rocky was unsure, poking at the ground and sniffing curiously but not fully understanding the task at hand. But Sarah's team guided him, showing him where to look for berries, roots, and other natural food sources. Over time, Rocky began to catch on. He learned how to use his keen sense of smell to identify edible plants and how to dig into the earth for insects and small creatures that could sustain him. The cub's confidence grew as he realized that he could provide for himself. But the challenges were far from over. The wilderness of Montana was still a harsh and unforgiving place. And the world outside the rehabilitation center was full of dangers. Wolves, other predators, and the brutal winter weather would all pose a threat to Rocky's survival. Sarah and her team knew that Rocky would need to be ready for the challenges he would face once he was released back into the wild. To prepare him for these challenges, they began to introduce him to different scenarios. They would simulate encounters with predators, testing how he would react to threats and helping him build the instincts he would need to survive. They also ensured that he was physically strong enough to endure the long winters of Montana, teaching him how to build up fat reserves and prepare for hibernation. Throughout this process, Sarah developed a deep bond with Rocky. She had seen many animals pass through her center, but there was something special about the young cub. She admired his resilience, his ability to overcome the hardships he had faced at such a young age. And she couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for him. Rocky had been given a second chance at life, and it was up to Sarah and her team to make sure he was ready for the world that awaited him. As the weeks turned into months, Rocky's progress continued. He had grown stronger, both physically and mentally. His movements were more fluid, his senses sharper. He had become more independent, no longer relying on humans for sustenance or comfort. He was learning to trust the wild, to trust his instincts, and soon, the time would come for him to return to the wilderness where he belonged. When the day of his release finally came, Sarah stood at the edge of the forest, watching as Rocky took his first steps into the wild. He paused for a moment, looking back at Sarah, as if to say goodbye. Then, without hesitation, he turned and disappeared into the trees, his large paws leaving deep impressions in the snow. Sarah's heart swelled with pride as she watched him go. She knew that Rocky would face challenges, but she also knew that he was ready. He had survived against the odds once before, and now, he had the skills and strength to thrive in the wild once more. It was a bittersweet moment for Sarah, but she understood that this was the ultimate goal of the center, to give animals like Rocky the chance to live freely, to return to their natural habitat, and to become a part of the wild once again. After 3 months of rehabilitation, Rocky was finally strong enough to be released back into the wild. The day of his return arrived with a sense of anticipation that filled the air. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the crisp spring air carried the faint scent of new growth in the trees. The snow that had once blanketed the land was melting away, and the once barren landscape was beginning to show signs of life again. Jim and Sarah stood together at the edge of the forest, preparing for this momentous occasion. They had watched Rocky grow from a fragile cub into a healthy young bear. And now, it was time for him to return to the wild where he belonged. It wasn't just a moment for them as individuals, but for the wild world they had dedicated their lives to protecting. Jim, with his years of experience in the wilderness, and Sarah, with her knowledge of animal care, Both knew that the true test of Rocky's survival would come once he was alone in the forest, far from the safety of their care. But they also knew this was a necessary step in his journey. The wilderness, for all its dangers, was where Rocky's life had always belonged. As they opened the door to the transport crate, Rocky stepped out slowly. His eyes, though still wide with caution, no longer carried the fear and uncertainty they had once held. He had grown stronger, more confident, and the instincts that would guide him through the wild were now beginning to surface. He hesitated for a moment, looking back at Jim and Sarah, as if to acknowledge the care they had given him. And then, with one final look, he stepped into the forest. The dense trees loomed before him, their shadows long in the early morning light, and the sound of rustling leaves filled the air. Rocky's journey had begun again. Jim and Sarah watched silently as he disappeared into the trees, knowing that this was the natural course of things. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, simply observing. There was a sense of pride in their hearts, but also an awareness of the uncertainty that lay ahead for Rocky. The wilderness was beautiful, but it was not kind, and survival would be a constant challenge. Yet, they both believed in the bear's strength, in the lessons he had learned during his time at the rehabilitation center. This was just the beginning of his journey, but it was a step in the right direction. It was a bittersweet moment for Sarah, who had grown attached to Rocky during his recovery. But she understood that he had to be free. The wild was where he would truly find his place, even if that meant facing the challenges of survival without human intervention. A year passed, and life continued in the wilderness. The seasons changed, and the world around Jim and Sarah remained in its endless cycle. They kept busy with their work, monitoring wildlife populations and continuing their efforts to protect the animals of the forest. One day, during a routine check on the tracking data, Jim noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. There, in the data logs, was the unmistakable sign of a bear, a grizzly, one he recognized from the markings on its fur. It was Rocky. Jim knew the moment he saw the marks that it was him. Rocky had survived, and not only had he survived, but he had thrived. The tracking showed that he had established his territory in a remote part of the forest, far from human interference, and that he had found a mate. The signs were clear. Rocky had grown into a strong, independent bear, and he was beginning to build his own family. Jim couldn't help but smile. This was the outcome he had hoped for. The proof that their efforts had made a difference. The interventions they had made had given Rocky a chance. And now, he was living the life he was meant to live. Jim shared the news with Sarah, who, like him, was overcome with emotion. It was a success beyond what they had imagined. The forest, once a place of danger and uncertainty for Rocky, had become his home once again. The bond they had formed with him during his recovery had not been in vain. The success of Rocky's return to the wild was a testament to the power of patience, care, and respect for the natural world. It was also a reminder that sometimes intervention was necessary. Without the help of Jim and Sarah, Rocky would not have had the chance to live out his natural life in the wild. The bears and wolves, the plants and the trees, and all the creatures that made the forest their home were a part of something greater. A fragile ecosystem that needed protection. Jim and Sarah knew that their work was far from over, but for now, they allowed themselves a moment of quiet satisfaction. Rocky had found his place in the wilderness, and that was all they could have hoped for. As they looked out at the forest, they understood that the wild would always be unpredictable, full of challenges and uncertainties. But for now, they could be sure of one thing: Rocky had made it. He was a part of the forest now, a living testament to the strength of nature and the potential for recovery. Even when things seem hopeless, the story of Rocky's return to the wild was far from over. And Jim and Sarah both knew that it was only the beginning. The wilderness would continue to shape him, just as it shaped all the creatures that called it home. And as for Jim and Sarah, they would keep working, keep protecting, and keep doing their part to ensure that the wild, and the animals like Rocky, had a chance to thrive. Their efforts had made a difference in one bear's life, and that was enough to keep them going. The story of Rocky's journey was not just his own, it was the story of the wilderness. And of the people who chose to protect it. The forest, full of life and possibility, would continue to be his home.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.